The morning of December the 16th, 1944, in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, a young German machine gunner named Franz Gockel crouched in his foxhole and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Above the tree line, approximately 30 meters in the air, American artillery shells were exploding in perfect synchronized bursts, not when they hit the ground, not when they struck a tree, but in midair, exactly where they would do the most damage to men caught in the open. Gockel had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He had endured Stalingrad. He had witnessed Soviet artillery barrages that lasted for hours, but he had never seen anything like this. The shells seemed to know exactly where to detonate, as if they possessed some form of impossible awareness. His training had taught him that artillery was a weapon of attrition, a blunt instrument that required dozens of rounds to achieve what these American shells accomplished with one. Watching the precise airbursts tear through his company's advance, Gockel understood with sudden, terrible clarity that someone had changed the fundamental rules of warfare, and no one had bothered to inform the German army. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon that Franz Gockel encountered that morning in the Ardennes was the VT fuse, officially designated as the variable time fuse, though every American artilleryman knew it really stood for something else. The proximity fuse represented the most closely guarded secret of the Second World War after the atomic bomb, and for good reason. This small device, no larger than a man's forearm, transformed artillery from an area denial weapon into a precise instrument of devastation. Before the proximity fuse, artillery was governed by the same basic principles that had ruled warfare since the invention of gunpowder. A shell left the barrel, traveled in a ballistic arc, and detonated on impact with the ground or whatever obstacle it struck first. This meant that troops could shelter behind terrain features, in foxholes, or among trees with reasonable confidence that artillery fire, while terrifying, was survivable if you could get low enough. The proximity fuse eliminated that calculation entirely. To understand the revolutionary nature of this technology, one must first understand what artillery doctrine looked like in 1944. The German army, which possessed some of the finest artillery traditions in Europe, trained its gunners according to principles refined over centuries of warfare. Artillery was meant to soften enemy positions, suppress movement, and create zones of danger that infantry could exploit. Accuracy was achieved through careful calculation of range, elevation, and wind conditions, combined with the systematic adjustment of fire through observation. A typical fire mission might require a dozen ranging shots before achieving the desired effect. Even then, the effectiveness of artillery depended heavily on the target. Troops in the open were vulnerable. Troops in covered positions were relatively safe unless a shell happened to land directly in their position, a matter of mathematical improbability, given the dispersed nature of defensive positions. The German experience with artillery, particularly on the Eastern Front, had taught Franz Gockel and soldiers like him a simple survival calculus. When shells began to fall, you went to ground. You found the lowest point of terrain available. You pressed yourself into the earth and you waited for the barrage to end. Casualties occurred, certainly, but they were manageable. The mathematics of artillery fire were well understood. A shell burst created a lethal radius of perhaps 10 to 15 meters, depending on caliber. Fragments traveled in relatively predictable patterns, with the majority of the force directed laterally from the point of impact. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole, or even a hastily scraped depression, had a reasonable chance of survival. This understanding was fundamental to infantry tactics across all armies in the Second World War. The American military establishment had understood these same principles, but a small group of scientists and engineers had begun asking a different question in the early years of the war. What if artillery shells didn't need to wait until they hit something to explode? What if they could sense their proximity to a target and detonate at the optimal moment for maximum effect? The concept was theoretically simple but practically staggering in its implications. An artillery shell that exploded 30 meters above the ground would shower fragments downward over a much wider area than a ground burst. More importantly, it would eliminate the protective value of terrain. A foxhole that could shelter you from a ground burst offered no protection whatsoever from fragments raining down from above. The idea wasn't new. Armies had experimented with time fuses that allowed shells to burst in the air since the 19th century. But time fuses required precise calculation of range and flight time, and even small errors resulted in shells that burst too high to be effective or impacted the ground before detonating. What American scientists developed at the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University was something fundamentally different. They created a miniature radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive the enormous acceleration of being fired from a gun, and sophisticated enough to detect the presence of the ground below and trigger detonation at a preset height. The device worked on the Doppler principle. As the shell descended, the radio signal it transmitted would bounce off the ground below. When the returning signal indicated the shell had reached the optimal burst height, typically between 20 and 30 meters, a tiny vacuum tube would close a circuit and trigger the detonation. The technical challenges were extraordinary. An artillery shell fired from a standard 105-millimeter howitzer experiences acceleration forces of approximately 20,000 times the force of gravity. Electronic components in 1943 were fragile devices built around delicate glass vacuum tubes. The idea of putting radio equipment through such violence and expecting it to function seemed absurd. Yet the engineers at Johns Hopkins, working under the direction of Merle Tuve, managed to create vacuum tubes, ruggedized enough to survive the shock and sensitive enough to detect ground return signals in the fraction of a second available before impact. The fuses were manufactured by the millions at facilities across the United States, each one a small miracle of mass-produced precision engineering. The weapon was so secret that American artillery crews firing shells equipped with proximity fuses in the European theater were forbidden from using them over enemy-held territory until the Normandy invasion was well underway. The fear was simple and reasonable. If the Germans captured an unexploded shell with an intact proximity fuse, they would understand the principle and potentially develop their own version. This security concern was so severe that proximity-fused shells were initially approved only for anti-aircraft use, where any unexploded rounds would fall into the sea or in Allied-controlled territory. The fuse proved devastatingly effective against aircraft, increasing the probability of shooting down an enemy plane by a factor of 5 compared to conventional time-fused anti-aircraft shells. But its potential against ground targets was understood to be even more significant. By December of 1944, when Germany launched its final desperate offensive in the west through the Ardennes forest, American forces had been authorized to use proximity fuses against ground targets. The German attack, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Adolf Hitler's attempt to split the American and British armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. The offensive relied on speed, surprise, and the shock value of concentrated armor. German commanders understood they were racing against time, against American reinforcements, against clearing weather that would bring Allied air superiority to bear, and against the simple mathematics of attrition that favored an enemy with effectively unlimited industrial capacity. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the fundamental tactical equation of artillery warfare had been rewritten. Franz Gockel belonged to the 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the elite formations committed to the offensive. His unit had been pulled from the Eastern Front, refitted, and given priority for fuel and ammunition, luxuries that had become increasingly rare in the German military by late 1944. The men of the 12th SS were veterans, survivors of brutal combat against the Soviet army. They understood firepower. They understood artillery. They believed they understood the capabilities and limitations of American forces based on intelligence assessments and their own combat experience in Normandy. Those assessments suggested that while American artillery was abundant, it was not particularly accurate or sophisticated. American gunners, the intelligence report said, relied on overwhelming volume of fire rather than precision. This was supposed to be a manageable problem. The offensive began before dawn on December 16th, with a massive German artillery barrage against thinly held American positions. In the opening hours, surprise was complete, and German forces achieved significant penetration of American lines. But the response, when it came, was unlike anything German veterans had experienced. American artillery began falling with a volume that dwarfed anything seen on the Western Front. But it was the nature of that artillery fire that caused confusion and then spreading horror among German infantry. Shells were exploding above the ground, not occasionally, as might happen with a defective fuse or a tree burst, but systematically, shell after shell, detonating at what seemed like the perfect height to maximize casualties among troops in the open. Franz Gockel survived that first day, but his company did not. Of the 140 men who had advanced into the Ardennes forest that morning, fewer than 60 answered roll call that evening. The casualty rate was unprecedented, and it wasn't the result of direct combat with American infantry. It was artillery. The survivors spoke in confused, frightened terms about shells that seemed to hunt them, that knew when they were in the open, and chose that precise moment to detonate. Gockel wrote in a letter that would later be recovered from his effects that the American artillery possessed some form of scientific magic that allowed the shells to see us. He was closer to the truth than he realized. The proximity fuse exploited a fundamental vulnerability in infantry tactics that had existed since the beginning of warfare but had never before been practically addressable. Infantry moving across terrain must occasionally expose themselves. They must leave their foxholes to advance, to retreat, to reposition. The entire tactical dance of infantry combat involved calculating risks. How long can I remain exposed before taking cover? How much ground can I gain before the next artillery barrage? Where is the nearest defilade that will protect me from incoming fire? The proximity fuse made those calculations irrelevant. There was no defilade from shells that exploded above you. There was no safety in spacing out your unit because the lethal radius of an airburst was significantly larger than a ground burst. A single 105 mm shell with a proximity fuse could achieve casualties over an area roughly 3 times larger than the same shell with a conventional fuse. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. A conventional artillery shell detonating on impact creates a fragmentation pattern that radiates outward and upward from the point of impact. The ground absorbs a significant portion of the blast energy in fragments. Troops in covered positions, foxholes behind walls and building ruins, are largely protected. Troops in the open face danger primarily from fragments traveling in a roughly lateral pattern from the point of impact. But an airburst at 30 meters elevation showers fragments almost straight down over a circular area whose radius depends on the burst height and the initial velocity of the fragments. The fragmentation pattern from a proximity-fused shell was far more efficient at causing casualties. Every fragment had a clear path to the ground below, unimpeded by terrain features. American artillery doctrine adapted to exploit this new capability with shocking speed. Forward observers, the soldiers responsible for calling in artillery fire, received new guidance on how to employ proximity-fused ammunition. The optimal targets were troops in the open, troops moving through wooded areas where conventional shells might detonate harmlessly in the trees, and troops in foxholes or trenches where overhead protection was minimal or absent. Artillery batteries received priority allocations of the new ammunition for missions where it would be most effective. The result was a multiplication of artillery effectiveness that German forces were completely unprepared to counter. Oberst Hans von Luck, a regimental commander in the 21st Panzer Division who fought in the Ardennes, later wrote in his memoir that American artillery in December of 1944 was qualitatively different from anything we had encountered previously. Von Luck was a veteran of the French campaign North Africa and the Eastern Front. He understood artillery, but he noted that casualties from American artillery fire in the Ardennes were running at approximately twice the rate his unit had experienced in comparable engagements earlier in the war, and those casualties were distributed differently. Normally, junior officers and NCOs who exposed themselves to direct their men suffered disproportionate casualties. In the Ardennes, casualties were more evenly distributed across units, including among soldiers who had taken what should have been adequate cover. Von Luck attributed this to improved American fire direction and increased volume of fire. He didn't know about the proximity fuse. That information would not become clear to German intelligence until after the war ended. The German army did capture unexploded American artillery shells during the Battle of the Bulge, and some of those shells were equipped with proximity fuses. German ordnance experts examined them and were baffled. The fuses contained radio components, but the purpose and function were not immediately obvious. By the time German scientists understood what they were looking at, the war situation had deteriorated to the point where developing a counter-weapon was impossible. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the time, and the resources to manufacture anything similar. Even if they had possessed the technical knowledge, which was doubtful, the economic reality of December 1944 made the point moot. German industry was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Raw materials were scarce. The transportation network was collapsing. Developing a sophisticated electronic fuse requiring precision manufacturing and rare materials was simply not feasible. The proximity fuse represented something more than just a tactical advantage. It was a demonstration of the kind of warfare that industrial and scientific superiority made possible. The United States produced over 22 million proximity fuses during the war. 22 million individual units, each containing vacuum tubes, electronic components, a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, and a power source, all ruggedized to survive the violence of artillery fire, and miniaturized to fit inside a standard shell casing. This was mass production of high-technology weapons at a scale that no other nation could match. German industry, for comparison, produced approximately 400,000 of their most advanced tank destroyer, the Jagdpanzer 38, during the entire war. That vehicle was celebrated as a triumph of German engineering and mass production. The United States produced more than 50 times as many proximity fuses as Germany produced of their most mass-produced armored vehicle. The battle in the Ardennes continued through December and into January of 1945. The German offensive, which had initially achieved significant gains through surprise and concentration of force, ground to a halt and then reversed. There were many reasons for this. Clearing weather that allowed Allied air power to operate, American reinforcements rushed to the threatened sector. German fuel shortages that immobilized armor at critical moments. But the constant, devastating rain of American artillery played a crucial role in breaking the back of the German assault. Units that advanced found themselves subjected to artillery fire of unprecedented accuracy and lethality. Movement in daylight became nearly suicidal. Concentration of forces for attacks drew immediate and overwhelming artillery response. The Germans found themselves forced into the same defensive posture that had characterized warfare on the Western Front in 1918, but without the extensive trench systems and overhead protection that had made that defensive strategy viable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Franz Gockel died on January 4, 1945, killed by artillery fire during the German retreat from the Ardennes. He was 23 years old. His body was not recovered, and he is listed as missing in action in German military records. The letter he wrote describing the strange American shells that exploded in the air was found in his company's records after the war and is now preserved in the German Federal Military Archives. It represents one of the few contemporary German accounts of encountering proximity-fused artillery fire, written by someone who didn't understand what he was experiencing but described it with enough detail that the weapon is clearly identifiable. The effectiveness of the proximity fuse went beyond simple casualty statistics, devastating as those were. The weapon had a psychological impact that multiplied its tactical value. Soldiers subjected to proximity-fused artillery fire reported feeling helpless in ways that conventional artillery did not produce. Artillery had always been frightening, random, impersonal. But there had always been things you could do. Get low, find cover, wait it out. Proximity-fused fire eliminated those coping mechanisms. There was no effective counter. You couldn't dig deeper because the shells exploded above you. You couldn't hide behind terrain features because the fragments came straight down. The only defense was to not be where the shells were falling, which was not a strategy that allowed for conducting military operations. This psychological dimension became apparent in interrogations of German prisoners captured during and after the Battle of the Bulge. American intelligence officers noted a recurring theme in prisoner statements, a sense that American artillery was fundamentally different in some way that the prisoners couldn't quite articulate. They knew they were experiencing higher casualties from artillery than they had in previous engagements. They knew that taking cover seemed less effective. Some speculated that the Americans had developed a new type of high explosive that created larger fragmentation patterns. Others thought American artillery was simply being employed in greater concentrations. None of them understood the real reason, which was that American shells were equipped with miniature radar sets that allowed them to detonate at the optimal height for maximum effect. The proximity fuse was eventually employed in every theater where American forces fought. In the Pacific, it proved devastating against Japanese banzai charges and infiltration tactics. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks in which massed infantry would attempt to overrun American positions through speed and shock. American defensive doctrine had developed effective counters to these tactics, but they were costly in terms of ammunition, expenditure, and required alert, disciplined troops who could maintain fire discipline in the face of a terrifying assault. Proximity-fused artillery simplified the equation dramatically. Massed infantry in the open were the ideal target for airbursts. A single battalion of American artillery equipped with proximity fuses could break up a regimental-strength banzai charge before it reached American lines. In the Philippines campaign of 1945, Japanese forces attempting to defend Manila found themselves subjected to artillery fire that seemed to penetrate every defensive position. The Japanese had fortified buildings throughout the city, creating strong points that conventional artillery had difficulty neutralizing without destroying the structures entirely. Proximity-fused shells, programmed to detonate just above roof level, showered fragments downward through buildings, making upper floors and rooftop positions untenable. The Japanese adaptation was to move their defensive positions into basements and ground floors, which was exactly what American tactical doctrine wanted. It concentrated Japanese forces in positions that could be systematically reduced by infantry assault supported by direct fire weapons. The weapon's effectiveness was such that American artillery commanders developed specific tactical procedures for different target types. Against troops in the open, a high burst height of 30 to 40 meters maximized coverage area. Against troops in foxholes or trenches, a lower burst height of 15 to 20 meters increased fragment velocity and penetration. Against troops in wooded areas where conventional shells often detonated harmlessly in the treetops, proximity fuses were set to detonate just below the tree canopy, creating a lethal zone at ground level, while using the trees themselves to increase fragmentation through splintering wood. The tactical flexibility of the weapon made it valuable in virtually every combat situation where artillery could be employed. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the proximity fuse had become a standard component of American and British artillery doctrine. British forces received proximity fuses under Lend-Lease and employed them with similar effectiveness. The weapon contributed to the rapid collapse of German defensive positions in the final months of the war. German units that might have held defensive lines for days or weeks with conventional artillery fire found themselves overwhelmed in hours when subjected to proximity-fused fire. The mathematical advantages of the weapon: 3 times the casualty area of conventional shells, elimination of protective terrain, psychological impact on survivors, accumulated across thousands of separate engagements to create a significant shift in the overall balance of combat power. The Soviet Union was not provided with proximity fuses during the war, despite being an easy Allied power receiving massive amounts of American military aid. The reason was security. The United States did not trust Soviet intelligence security sufficiently to risk the technology falling into German hands through espionage or capture. This decision meant that Soviet artillery, while present in overwhelming quantities on the Eastern Front, remained limited to conventional fuses throughout the war. Soviet artillery doctrine evolved to emphasize massive concentrations of fire to overcome the limitations of conventional fusing, but this approach was wasteful of ammunition and required extensive logistical support. The proximity fuse represented a more elegant solution to the same problem, achieving decisive effects with fewer rounds. After the war ended, captured German scientists and engineers were extensively debriefed about their knowledge of Allied weapons and technology. The proximity fuse was consistently identified as one of the most significant surprises of the war, ranking alongside the atomic bomb in terms of technological advancement over existing capabilities. German scientists acknowledged that they had understood the theoretical principles that would allow for such a device, but had not believed it could be made practical given the miniaturization requirements and the need for components that could survive the shock of firing. The revelation that the Americans had not only made it practical but had manufactured it in quantities of millions represented a profound realization about the gap in industrial and scientific capability between the United States and Germany. This realization extended beyond the immediate tactical impact of the weapon. German military analysts reviewing the war in its aftermath understood that the proximity fuse was representative of a broader pattern. The United States had approached the war as an industrial and scientific problem to be solved through systematic application of research, development, and mass production. Problems were identified, solutions were engineered, and those solutions were manufactured at scales that overwhelmed any possible counter. The proximity fuse was one weapon among many that demonstrated this approach. Radar, improved sonar, fire control computers, the atomic bomb itself. Each represented the application of advanced science and engineering at an industrial scale. The cost of developing and producing proximity fuses was substantial, approximately $1 billion in 1944 dollars, equivalent to approximately $16 billion in 2025 terms, accounting for inflation. But that investment paid for itself many times over in reduced casualties, faster operational tempo, and psychological impact on enemy forces. Each proximity fuse cost approximately $18 to manufacture, compared to approximately $3 for a conventional artillery fuse. The five-fold increase in cost was more than justified by the multiplication of effectiveness. Artillery batteries could achieve the same effect with fewer rounds, which meant reduced logistical burden, faster response times, and conservation of gun barrels, which wore out after firing a certain number of rounds. The weapon also represented a shift in the fundamental economics of warfare. Throughout history, military effectiveness had been primarily determined by training, doctrine, and the courage and skill of individual soldiers. Technology mattered, certainly, but technological advantages could be overcome through tactical innovation, superior numbers, or better trained troops. The proximity fuse represented something different, a technological advantage so significant that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome it. A German infantry company, no matter how well trained or courageously led, could not effectively operate under proximity-fused artillery fire. The physics of the situation simply did not allow for effective counter-tactics. This realization was deeply disturbing to military professionals who had built their careers on the assumption that leadership, training, and tactical skill were the primary determinants of military success. The proximity fuse suggested that future wars might be decided primarily by industrial and scientific capacity, with human factors reduced to secondary importance. This was not an entirely new concept. The First World War had demonstrated the importance of industrial production capacity, but the proximity fuse made the point with particular clarity. A nation that could develop and mass-produce such weapons possessed a form of military power that could not be matched through traditional military virtues alone. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended well beyond World War II. The technology matured into increasingly sophisticated forms in subsequent decades. Modern artillery fuses incorporate programmable microprocessors that can be set to detonate at specific heights, specific points along the trajectory, or in response to specific target signatures. Anti-aircraft missiles use proximity fuses as standard equipment. The basic principle, using electromagnetic radiation to sense proximity to a target and trigger detonation at the optimal moment, remains fundamental to modern weapons design. The engineers at Johns Hopkins who developed the original VT fuse established principles and techniques that continue to influence weapons development into the 21st century. But in December of 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the proximity fuse was simply a terrible mystery to the soldiers experiencing its effects. Franz Gockel and thousands of soldiers like him encountered a weapon that seemed to violate the understood rules of artillery warfare. They died without understanding what had killed them, without knowing that they had been on the receiving end of a technology that represented one of the most significant advances in weapons effectiveness in military history. The shells that exploded above their heads were the product of scientific research, precision engineering, and mass production at a scale that their own nation, despite its reputation for industrial and scientific prowess, could not begin to match. The proximity fuse did not win World War II by itself. No single weapon, no matter how effective, determines the outcome of a conflict as vast and complex as the Second World War. But it was representative of the kind of war that the United States fought, a war of industrial production, scientific innovation, and systematic problem-solving applied to military challenges. Where other nations relied on tactical brilliance, superior training, or ideological fervor to overcome material disadvantages, the United States simply eliminated the disadvantages through superior technology, mass-produced in overwhelming quantities. The proximity fuse was this approach distilled to its essence. Identify a tactical problem, engineer a technological solution, manufacture it by the millions, and deploy it before the enemy understands what they're facing. For the soldiers who survived the war and spoke about their experiences in later years, the proximity fuse remained a vivid memory. American artillerymen who employed the weapon spoke of it with a mixture of professional pride and something approaching awe at its effectiveness. German veterans who faced it spoke of it with residual fear and a sense of helplessness that conventional artillery had never produced. The weapon represented a moment when technology fundamentally altered the tactical equation of warfare in a way that individual soldiers could immediately perceive. Unlike strategic bombing or naval warfare or logistical systems, which operated at scales too large for individual soldiers to fully comprehend, the proximity fuse was intimate and immediate in its effects. You saw the shells burst above you. You saw what happened to your comrades who were caught in the open. You understood, even if you didn't know the technical details, that something had changed in the fundamental nature of artillery warfare. The scientific team that developed the proximity fuse was honored after the war with military decorations and public recognition. Merle Tuve, who led the Applied Physics Laboratory's effort, received the Medal of Merit, the highest civilian decoration for wartime service. The citation noted that the proximity fuse had contributed to saving thousands of Allied lives and shortening the war. Those claims were almost certainly correct. The weapon's multiplication of artillery effectiveness meant that defensive positions could be overcome with fewer casualties among attacking forces. It meant that enemy concentrations could be broken up before they reached Allied lines. It meant that German and Japanese forces attempting to maneuver were subjected to fire so devastating that movement itself became prohibitively costly. In the final accounting, the proximity fuse represented something larger than its tactical effects, significant as those were. It demonstrated the decisive advantage that scientific and industrial superiority conferred in modern warfare. A nation that could mobilize its scientific establishment, convert theoretical concepts into engineered products, and manufacture those products in quantities of millions, possessed a form of military power that traditional military powers could not match. Germany had excellent scientists and engineers. Japan had a warrior tradition and tactical innovation. But neither nation could match the systematic, large-scale application of scientific research and industrial production that the United States brought to bear. The proximity fuse was one weapon among many that proved this point, but it was perhaps the clearest demonstration of the principle, a technological advantage so overwhelming that it changed the fundamental equation of ground combat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.